Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Radical History. Welcome back to another installment in the Haitian Revolution. Um, I had practiced getting this little chat widget working, and it appears to not be working. So, give me just 1 second to fix it because let's see if this works. There we go. Chat, you can see yourselves on my screen. Cool, right? Okay. So, over the past couple of weeks, I have been talking to you all and anyone who will listen to me about the Haitian Revolution. And it's taken a long time to get everything set up, but I think we're finally there. I think we have progressed to the point where we're able to really dig deep into it. And I haven't talked a whole lot about the actual slave insurrectionists, especially their leaders, which is not because I don't think that they're important. It's just that I wanted to make a couple of different points in the first two lectures. In the first one, I wanted to set up the circumstances of Saint-Domingue because they're important. And in the second one, I wanted to make the point that the slaves and the revolutionaries in Haiti freed themselves, that the decision by Sonthonax and Polverel and ultimately the French Directory to recognize their independence was not a gift granted by the benevolent French public, but in fact a response to the reality on the ground, which was that the slaves had freed themselves. So now that I think that we have established that, we can dig in deep to the actual events and circumstances of the revolution. And I'm going to do my very best to cover everything that I can. I have exhausted my notes before actually getting to the revolution, so I'm going to probably be winging the last 15 minutes or so. But we're going to make it work. I'm going to try to talk about everything. There's no way I can cover everything that's important, but feel free to ask questions if I miss anything, and hopefully we'll get to most of what's happening in the Haitian Revolution. If we get to the end of this and you feel like there's more you want to know, there's a couple of really excellent books on the Haitian Revolution which are easy to read and very informative. The first is, of course, C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, which is an older book, but a tremendous history of the Haitian Revolution. And then the other that I would recommend that I just finished, which is tremendous and a really, really good, if less dramatic retelling of the Haitian Revolution, is Avengers of the New World by Laurent Dubois. So hopefully I'll tell you everything that you want to know, but if you want to know more, both of those books are excellent. So let's talk about the people who are involved in the Haitian Revolution. These names are going to come up again and again, and I want you to know who they are. The person you see before you is a man named André Rigaud, who was born in Les Cayes in Saint-Domingue to André Rigaud, some relation, his father, a wealthy French planter, and Rose Bassi Depa, a slave woman. So as the son of a white plantation owner and a slave woman, he was a jeune de couleur, a mulatto, mixed race man. His father acknowledged him and sent him to Bordeaux, where he was trained as a goldsmith. He eventually returned to Saint-Domingue, and at the time of, so we've left off in 1794, 1795, with the Spanish and British having invaded Saint-Domingue, all of Europe at war with France. And at this time, André Rigaud is leading Spanish forces in the south and southeast of Saint-Domingue. Remember him, but we're going to keep going. Also important is a man named Henri Christophe, born Christophe Henry, probably maybe in Grenada, but possibly in St. Kitts. He was the son of a slave mother and a man named Christophe, who was a freeman. And he was brought as a slave to Saint-Domingue as a child. Christophe is really interesting for a number of reasons. You're going to, this is not a spoiler, but Henri Christophe is one of the future rulers of Saint-Domingue. He is president of Haiti. But it is also said that he served with the French forces as a drummer boy in the Chasseurs Volontaires. I'm sorry, my French is very bad. Volunteer Army of Saint-Domingue, a regiment composed of mostly free men of color, gens de couleur. It is said, and this is reported in both CLR James and Avengers of the New World, but neither historian is able to fully confirm it. But it is said that Henri Christophe fought at the Siege of Savannah for the Americans during the Revolutionary War. And there were a couple of other famous Haitian revolutionaries who were said to have fought for the Americans during the war. This is all very maybe not true, but it's a nice story and I like it. So remember Henri Christophe. Also of importance is Alexandre Pétion, who was born Alexandre Sabez in Port-au-Prince to, again, a wealthy French father, and Ursula, a free woman of color. He also went to France to study and be educated, and then returned to Saint-Domingue late in the 1790s. He, as you can see by this engraving, was also a president of Haiti. So, again, spoiler alert there. The other person that you should know, one of the many other people that you should know, is Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Dessalines was born a slave. He worked in the sugarcane fields as a laborer and rose to the rank of commandeur or foreman. And he worked on his plantation till he was about 30 years old. He was bought by a gens de couleur, a free black man named Dessalines, who gave him his surname. And he was Touissant Louverture's general or lieutenant for most of the revolution. And if you know anything, or of the names you're likely to have heard, Dessalines and Louverture are probably the two foremost. Dessalines is also a future leader of Haiti. But of course, the person who we are most interested in, one of the most fascinating and interesting, and in my opinion, significant historical figures of any time and any place, is of course Touissant Louverture. Louverture was born, again, a slave at the plantation of Breda and Haut de Cap in Saint-Domingue sometime in the 1740s. According to Louverture and his family, his grandfather was Galguenot, a son of the king of Alada, and his lineage as a son of a king in Africa was important to him and important to many of his followers. It gave him special authority, which he used to great effect. He was educated by his godfather, Pierre Baptiste, who was a free man who lived and worked on that plantation. He wrote in French and Creole, and his writings reveal familiarity with many of the classics, including Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher who had been a slave himself. He also showed references to Machiavelli and Abbé Raynal, a critic of slavery, abolitionist in France. At the time of the Revolution, very early, by 1791, the initial rising, Louverture was doing quite well for himself. He owned a small coffee plantation and had at one point owned at least one slave. It is unclear how many slaves Louverture owned. It is clear that he freed them all before the Revolution. Is that true? That's true. Before the Revolution. Sometime in 1792, 1793, he adopts the surname Louverture, which is from the French word for opening, or maybe it means the one who opened the way. Most historians believe that this refers to his ability to create openings in battle. The Commissioner Polverel said at one point that this man creates an opening everywhere. And this was his name throughout the rest of the revolution. By 1792, 1793, he was fighting for the Spanish and had distinguished himself as a leader of men and a keen tactical and strategic mind. So when we last left off our revolutionaries, they had just won full emancipation from France. Sonthonax and Polverel had declared that all the slaves of Saint-Domingue were free, and then the 1794, the Directory recognized that freedom, and Rigaud and Louverture and a few others, Dessalines and Louverture's other lieutenants, are all fighting for the Spanish. But in 1794, Louverture defects. He switches sides from the Spanish to the French, turns on his Spanish allies, and attacks them, taking all of his troops with him. It is unclear why exactly he does this at this point, but throughout his life, Louverture is extremely clear and extremely committed to the cause of emancipation. This is perhaps the one thing that he is unwavering on in terms of his ideals. And he had been fighting for the Spanish because they had promised him and Rigaud and their other and the men fighting for them freedom. But it seems clear to me, and there is some disagreement on this, so this is just Rob's opinion, that Louverture genuinely believed that the French Republic offered him and his men the best chance for true freedom and emancipation, independence, liberty, and that he genuinely believed in Republican ideals. And it appears that once he was convinced that France would honor those ideals, he switched sides and helped drive back the Spanish. And this was in 1794. In 1795, the French, again as part of their wars of revolution, invade Spain, push deep into Spanish territory in Europe, and Spain sues for peace, ceding Santo Domingo, the eastern part of Hispaniola, in exchange for a return to pre-war borders in Europe, which left just Britain on Saint-Domingue fighting against the French. So at this time, things are going pretty poorly for the non-French persons in Europe. A upstart, brilliant general named Napoleon Bonaparte is sweeping through Europe. He has not yet become emperor or anything like that, but he is kicking ass and taking names. And the British still have control of the sea, but things are going pretty poorly for them in terms of maintaining their control and pushing for their interests. So Minister Pitt decides to send I actually don't remember what he called it. I wrote down a surge of 30,000 men to the French West Indies to finish the job there, to take Martinique and Guadeloupe and, of course, Saint-Domingue. Unfortunately, things go really poorly for the British almost immediately. In 1795 and 1796, Britain loses thousands upon thousands of men to yellow fever, desertion, and guerrilla fighting with Louverture and other revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue. Pétion distinguishes himself in a defense of Léogâne, and Britain during this time loses almost all of their territorial gains. They had controlled Port-au-Prince, and much of the southern and southwestern part of the island, but they lose most of this. Britain had promised freedom to cultivators, to slaves, in exchange for service in the army, but this loyalty was never guaranteed. Up until this point, their auxiliaries had been pretty loyal, had fought for them, and again, in exchange for freedom. But In late 1796, things started to turn for the British. Republicans, the Haitian revolutionaries under Louverture and others, took a series of important mountain forts that had been built by the British. And then at this point, slaves in those armies begin to escape and revolt and join Louverture, including some soldiers in the Black Corps that had been established by the British to. They deserted. The British had established a Black Corps of soldiers. I think they were called the Jamaica Corps or the Black Powders, and they started to desert in large numbers to Louverture and the Republicans. The prospect of immediate freedom was clearly enticing. Plus, Louverture was winning a lot of battles, and this made him attractive, as well as the fact that they would be serving under a black officer rather than a white one. Thank you, Terwilliger Van Buren. No one has commented on my glasses yet, but I appreciate you noticing. An observer wrote that at the sight of the tricolor flag, black soldiers serving the British went out to the other side, happy to be serving under a general of their race. So by the end of 1797, things are going very, very, very badly for the British. Many thousands have died, and very little had been accomplished. Millions of pounds and thousands of lives have been expended essentially for nothing. So the British start looking for ways to cut their losses. This guy on the left, Colonel Thomas Maitland of the 62nd Regiment of Foot, had arrived essentially just as Louverture and the other commanders had begun their offensive in the mountains. He wrote at this time in a letter to his brother that his forces in Saint-Domingue had been annihilated by the yellow fever. Another officer wrote that he had seen his friends drowned in their own blood, and some died raving mad. So Maitland started looking for reasons or ways to get away or get out of Saint-Domingue, cut his losses, and go on his way. He approached, even though the leader of the French forces in Saint-Domingue was a man named Hérouville, technically, Maitland approached Louverture and began to negotiate a British withdrawal. In return for a guarantee of good treatment for the French planters in the areas under British control, and Louverture's promise to not destroy any property in the region, he would evacuate peacefully. And he did. Louverture marched into Port-au-Prince and occupied it and negotiated the final withdrawal. Now, interestingly, at this point, he signed a secret treaty with Maitland, promising not to attack or encourage sedition in Jamaica nearby. In exchange, Maitland agreed to end the British blockade of the island. What's interesting about this is that France and Britain were still at war, and Louverture was negotiating essentially independently of the French metropole, promising peace between French Saint-Domingue and British Jamaica, which he was not authorized to do, but he did anyway. And so Maitland withdraws, lifts the blockade, and Louverture is essentially in ultimate control of the island of Hispaniola, of Saint-Domingue, and begins establishing and consolidating his rule there. So, what does he do? Well, so Saint-Domingue, as we have mentioned time and time and time again, is a commodity-driven colony, right? It produced, like I mentioned, a obscene portion of the world's sugar and coffee at the time of the Revolution, and was not set up for really any other type of agriculture. It relied extensively on trade, There were not systems or land in place for large-scale food crops or other forms of industry. And so Louverture sets about restoring the plantation economy. And he goes about doing this in a number of ways. And I don't want to mince words here because he's a real dick about it. He does not restore slavery. Everybody is free, and all laborers are paid for their labor. However, Louverture makes it pretty clear that you need to go back to your sugar plantation and get to work. And there are a lot of different ways that he approaches this, but ultimately it is a system of coercion and force rather than sort of free labor. And I mentioned that there had been other plans for how to get people back to work, how to restore the plantation economy that did not involve forcing people to work, did not involve, a form of sharecropping or indentured servitude. But Louverture chooses not to do this. His approach to this is to institute laws to essentially push cultivators back to their plantations. He was sympathetic to white planters, or at least outwardly so. He tried to ensure that they knew that he was going to allow them to keep their property. They were not going to be killed or their land redistributed. And it is clear during this time that he is committed above all to preserving emancipation. But that he believed, and it is clear, that the only way to do so was to make Saint-Domingue profitable. If Saint-Domingue did not return to the metropole, did not return to France, the kind of profits, or at least some profits, similar to what it had done under slavery, that the French would not tolerate a colony of free slaves. And so his plan for this was to essentially rule with an iron fist. Touissant Louverture made himself into something of a dictator and could be tyrannical. Some of these behaviors, some of these actions are understandable and justifiable within the framework of trying to preserve the liberty of Saint-Domingue, and some of them are not. Some of them are clearly actions of a man trying to consolidate his own power, like when he declares war on André Rigaud in 1780 or 1799. So Rigaud had been in control of the southern province and had been Louverture's ally, essentially, in fighting with the French. But under a bunch of trumped-up pretenses, Louverture declared him an outlaw and went to war with him, and acquired the help of both the French and, as it turns out, the American Navy to blockade the southern ports, and in the bloody War of Knives, defeated Rigaud and drove him from the island, securing essentially complete control for himself. At this same time, that upstart general, Napoleon Bonaparte, executes a bloodless coup on the 9th of November in 1799 and declares himself first consul of France, ending, in the view of most historians, the French Revolution. Now, immediately, Bonaparte is not immediately hostile to Louverture. He has other things to worry about. But in his new constitution, it decrees, among other things, that because of the difference in the nature of things and the climate, the colonies were to be governed by special laws. So it's unclear how things are going to work, but Louverture chooses to sort of forge ahead with his own plan, despite Bonaparte's ascension to first consul, and he begins making a new constitution for Saint-Domingue. He declares the convocation of a constituent assembly that would draft a constitution for Saint-Domingue. And he gets a lot of input on this. Interestingly, one person who sends advice to him is Alexander Hamilton, who recommends, among other things, and this is hilarious, a lifelong executive and the enrollment of all males in the militia. If you were here for my worst founding fathers lecture, Hamilton is way up there. Bad ideas, that guy. No slaves, bad ideas. Yeah, I actually have not seen the Hamilton musical. I don't know if this is mentioned, but it should be. It'd be funny. Among other things, the Constitution that is written in Saint-Domingue declares all men are born, live, and die free and French. This is one of the things that Louverture makes sure to enshrine, which is emancipation. This is, the one thing that he is truly committed to is the ending of slavery. The other thing that he is committed to is the glory of Touissant Louverture, who was declared governor of Saint-Domingue for the rest of his glorious life. Now, many people are not happy with Louverture during this time. There are uprisings, there are complaints, people refuse to go to work. It is a difficult time, but Louverture is also very popular in general. He's extremely competent. He is very good at holding everything together despite the many, many, many forces working against him. But in 1801, there is an uprising mostly by French white planters, which Louverture sends Dessalines to put down violently. He executes a couple of his lieutenants who he doesn't trust. And this seems to really light a fire under Louverture's ass. He's really on one from here on out. And he institutes a new system of surveillance, this really like complex bureaucracy, making sure that everybody is doing their work. He outlaws voodoo, among other things, and cracks down on any form of idleness or unwillingness to work. One historian describes this as a crushing condemnation of the social world of Saint-Domingue and a charter for a new police state in which the duty of all citizens to work for the state would be strictly enforced. Now, here's the truly wild thing about this is that it appears to work. By 1801, according to official reports, coffee exports had risen from basically nothing to 2/3 of what they had been in 1789. And by 1802, sugar exports were at 1/3 of those of 1789, which did not include a significant amount of underground and contraband trade, which was supported by the regime. The sugar plantations have been devastated by much more so than the coffee plantations by years of war. So this was impressive in and of itself. So by all accounts, Louverture was wrangling Saint-Domingue back into shape. But Napoleon could not deal with the explicit and implicit challenge to his authority. So Louverture sent a copy of this constitution to Napoleon, and upon receiving it, Napoleon was reportedly, or the indignation of the first consul was extreme. The conduct of Touissant Louverture struck him as an attack on the authority and dignity of the Republic. So he started putting together a plan. He put his brother-in-law, Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, who you can see right here, in charge of an expedition to dislodge Louverture. Now, the explicit reason for this was to support him, but we're not idiots. Napoleon's not an idiot. Louverture's not an idiot. We all know what it was there for, and it was to reestablish control of the colony. In private, Bonaparte said he commanded Leclerc, do not allow any blacks having held a rank above that of captain to remain on the island. His main plan for restoring order was to essentially deport all of the leaders and restore the cultivators, the soldiers and workers back to their plantations. Rid us of these gilded Negroes, Bonaparte wrote to Leclerc in July 1802, and we will have nothing to wish for. In communications with other European polities, Napoleon's ministers described this as a crusade of civilized people of the West against the black barbarism that was on the rise in America. Now, the thing that made this possible was that in 1802, the British signed Napoleon does suck. And I'm gonna digress on that in a second. But the British signed a very temporary peace treaty with France. This lasted about a year, but it meant that France could send ships because they weren't going to get blown up by the British Navy. It also meant it freed up a lot of resources for France to put down the Saint-Domingue insurrection once and for all. So this expedition, led by Leclerc, consisted of 50 ships, most or about half of France's large naval vessels, 22,000 soldiers, 20,000 sailors, and ultimately Leclerc would send upwards of 80,000 fighting men. Now, until this point, Louverture and his soldiers had not been fighting more than just a few thousand troops at a time, even among the British. This represented an entirely new challenge for Louverture and for the insurrectionists, the revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue. So if you read some of the histories of this time period, the historians will kind of waffle about Napoleon, about whether or not he was a racist, whether or not he hated black people. It is clear to me, from his writing and from the histories, that he was at least as racist as everybody else, and possibly more so. From what I know about Napoleon, it strikes me that he probably was more angry and offended about Louverture challenging him than he was about the fact that he was black, but it also clearly mattered that Louverture was black. Napoleon was not uniquely racist or uniquely hated black people, but he was a power-hungry dictator, and he was absolutely furious that anybody would challenge him, and he wanted Saint-Domingue to come back into the control of the metropole and start producing valuable goods for France. This appears clear to me. It also appears clear to me that both men, Louverture and Napoleon, believed themselves to be important, powerful, leaders of men, and that this was essentially there's no such thing as destined to happen, but it's hard to imagine a world in which these two men get along. Here's my spicy take, and that's that Louverture was better than Napoleon. If Louverture had been born a white man in Europe, he probably would have ended up emperor. He, did more with less. And if they had met on an equal field of battle, I'm having trouble imagining that Louverture would have lost. That is not supported by any historical evidence, but that is what I feel. And Napoleon was said on his deathbed to have regretted this more than anything. That he wishes that he had recognized Louverture and chosen to support him rather than sending Leclerc and so many men to die. Whether or not this is just the deathbed regrets of a man in prison is unclear, but he did say it. So, and I have another digression about this whole thing, but I'll save it for the end. So Leclerc lands on Saint-Domingue, and like I said, initially he pretends that he is there to support Louverture, and he sends some missives to greet with him. But Louverture knows what's going on. He doesn't play ball, and essentially right away Leclerc announces that all the good Frenchmen who live in Saint-Domingue must recognize the black general as a monster who preferred the destruction of his country to the surrender of his power. And French troops, under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, son of the Rochambeau who fought for the Americans in the Revolution, Rochambeau decided to make an example of these black troops and slaughtered hundreds of them after they had surrendered. Rochambeau would continue to do this throughout the War of Independence, and he was an awful nightmare genocidaire of a man, and I hope he's burning in hell. Leclerc would also admit, and this was the fear of Louverture and basically all freed slaves on the island, was that the French were there to restore slavery. And from the very beginning, Napoleon and Leclerc knew that it would be impossible to subdue the island if anybody thought that they were there to restore slavery. And so they pretended like they weren't. But from the very beginning, Leclerc, and he admitted this later, he admitted that some blacks were captured, captured, and then sold as slaves. From the very beginning, it is clear from anybody who is looking close enough that they do intend to restore slavery. Now, France has overwhelming material support, numbers, organization, and they win all of the initial battles technically, but they fail to make gains. Leclerc was encountering a new and difficult style of warfare. He said, "This is a war of Arabs. We have barely passed before the blacks occupy the woods surrounding the road and cut off our communication." They had made contact initially with the maroon bands in the interior of the island, but they struggled to make alliances with any of the thank you. There you go, Terwilliger Van Buren. It's I did it for you. They made some initial inroads with opponents to Louverture. Not everyone was a fan of him, but they failed to really make any deep alliances. And the longer that things went on for the French, the more and more they struggled to maintain any alliances with any of the free black militias. A French officer recalled that they were victors everywhere but possessed nothing but their rifles. The enemy held nowhere and yet never ceased to be master of the country. And ultimately, what the French had to do, or what the French decided they had to do to maintain control, was institute a terror campaign. They began executing without any sort of discrimination any black soldiers that they captured. One officer announced, "It is only through terrible examples that we will succeed in disarming the country and give this important colony back its splendor and prosperity. I give you permission to hang any rebel or malcontent." One officer, fed up with the executions, noted that the French, and this was their preferred form of execution, had drowned nearly 4,000 colonial troops. This is how we are fighting our war. The French will never be masters of this country. Famously, Rochambeau imported dogs from Cuba, and then provoked them into attacking black soldiers. He would gather people together in the public places of Le Cap, and aiming to lift white morale, he would establish a circus where he essentially fed black prisoners to the dogs. He would sometimes cut them so that the dogs would attack when they didn't want to. Rochambeau ordered his victims, military and civilian, burned alive, drowned in sacks, hung, crucified, asphyxiated, and shot after digging their graves. Now, I also want to be clear that as soon as these atrocities start, Louverture and his soldiers respond in turn. They do not execute everybody in the same way that Rochambeau does. Rochambeau is far and away, in my opinion, the most awful and gruesome involved in any side of this war. But Dessalines especially visits some pretty serious violence upon innocent, well, are there innocents? On civilian and non-civilian whites alike, especially on white soldiers. And increasingly, Louverture's army, which had been integrated, becomes largely a black army, though not exclusively. And by 1802, 1803, things have gone pretty poorly for everybody involved. Louverture, eventually, after multiple of his lieutenants sue for peace or surrender, he himself sues for peace and negotiates something of a deal with Leclerc and the rest of the French. Leclerc, of course, would like to execute every black leader in Saint-Domingue, but he knows that he cannot control the island without their help, and so he is in a difficult position. And so he keeps Louverture and Dessalines and other significant leaders on to try to maintain control, but ultimately decides that he cannot manage Louverture anymore and has him secretly arrested and shipped to France. Louverture sadly dies in prison in France a few years later, far from his native home of Saint-Domingue, and Dessalines becomes the leader of the resistance in Saint-Domingue. And in 1802, 1803, the yellow fever takes a substantial toll on the French troops, just as it had on the British, and tens of thousands of them ultimately are killed. It becomes clear that it is going to be extremely difficult to hold on to the island without the help of Dessalines. And then what truly puts the nail in the coffin is that war breaks out again in Europe. And France and Britain are again at war without being able to travel freely across the sea. Leclerc is no longer guaranteed any reinforcements, not that he was getting any in the first place. And to make matters worse, Leclerc himself falls ill to yellow fever and dies. Rochambeau, who is at this point the head of the French forces in Saint-Domingue, negotiates a surrender and is allowed to leave. There were over 50,000 French troops died in this effort, and the vast majority of sailors and soldiers sent to the colonies since 1802. And at long last, Dessalines and his soldiers are able to exert control briefly over the entire island. And on the 1st of January, 1804, declares independence fully from France, and they draft their own constitution and name the new island that they are on, Haiti. There's a lot of things in this constitution that are great. It is modeled after a lot of what had been put out before by Louverture and others. And it declares, among other things, we must, with one last act of national authority, forever assure the empire of liberty in the country whose birth we have witnessed. It also declares eternal hatred of France, among other things. And it also establishes Haiti as a black nation, ultimately a free black country. Now, there is a expulsion and a massacre of many French whites at this point in time. And if you read a lot of histories or a lot of older histories or a lot of just overviews of the Haitian Revolution, they will tell you something about a genocide at the end. That is not actually accurate. Dessalines allowed a lot of whites to remain in Haiti free, unharmed, and there were the three main groups. White widows were allowed to retain their property and stay on their land. Polish soldiers who had deserted or joined the Revolutionary Army were allowed to stay, and there were groups of Germans that had been settled in the colony before the revolution. And Dessalines in his constitution declares all Haitians black, regardless of actually what color your skin was. It was sort of just the designation. If you were Haitian, you were black. This is, of course, revolutionary. And this was not, unfortunately, the beginning of a glorious future for Haiti. Over 100,000 people had died. Haitians had died in the course of the revolution. And Dessalines would only lead the country for 2 years before he was assassinated. Then Pétion and Christophe and a whole host of others would rule parts or all of the country. Though they did not try to invade Haiti again, the Western powers would pretty sort of assiduously ignore and isolate the country. Initially, America, especially, was willing to trade with Saint-Domingue, also especially during the Quasi-War when it was sort of at war with France. But Jefferson greatly feared the influence of a free Haiti and decided to implement a policy of isolation, of leaving it alone, and of making sure that it did not receive any support beyond just the basic trade. He wrote that as long as we don't allow the blacks to possess a ship, we can allow them to exist and even maintain very lucrative commercial contracts with them. And that was the American policy for essentially the rest of the 19th century. It wouldn't be until 1862, during the Civil War, when Charles Sumner, the abolitionist senator who was caned on the Senate floor, to open relations with Haiti. And it would be even longer before the rest of the world followed suit. You probably know or have heard of the fact that France essentially at gunpoint extracted restitution from Haiti for lost wealth in 1825, forcing the Haitian government to take loans from French banks, which they did not pay off until the 1950s, which sort of forced the country into a cycle of debt that they still have not pulled themselves out of. America also re-invaded Haiti. I don't know if you know this, in 1915, and troops were there until the 1930s. One of the things that the United States did while it was occupying Haiti was force a new constitution, which, among other things, allowed whites, especially European whites, to own land again. But this didn't stop Haiti from becoming a beacon of liberty throughout the world. Haiti offered support to Simon Bolivar, the liberator, on the condition that he free slaves. They provided support to liberation movements in Cuba and Puerto Rico and elsewhere. The revolutionaries of Haiti were inspirations to Frederick Douglass and John Brown and others. And the way that the rest of the world has treated Haiti is a clear, to me, a very, very clear indicator of what the West truly values. And I think it is rare that you get a point where values and material interests diverge so clearly. And if France, if the United States, if Britain were so committed to the ideas of enlightenment, to liberty, as they said that they were, there would be no excuse for the way that Haiti was treated and isolated. But as it turns out, racism and greed, capital, are substantially, or were at the time substantially, more powerful than any ostensible commitment to Enlightenment ideals. And this is not news to anybody, but this is one of the areas where you can see the distinction so clearly. It is just crystal clear that this was bad decision making, cruelty, violence, repression, driven by nothing more than the desperate greed and a fear of a free black state. Louverture, throughout his life, was willing to work with and submit to Napoleon and to France at every point. He considered himself French. He considered himself a Republican. And yet, he was given no support except when he demanded it. At any point, he could have, before he actually did, he could have driven the French out. He could have easily done so, but he continued to ask for their support and work within their frameworks. Because of Napoleon's abysmal failure here, Haiti is the Haitian Revolution is singularly responsible for the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon had plans to settle and use the Louisiana territory to sort of feed the growing armies in both France and the French West Indies. But because of the catastrophic failure of the Leclerc expedition, he was forced to sell. If this had not happened, if this had gone differently, we would be living in an entirely different world. And one of my very favorite historical what-ifs is what might the world look like if Napoleon had recognized Louverture's government, declared him, consul or president or whatever of Saint-Domingue, and supported him rather than throwing away tens of thousands of lives. I firmly believe that the West, especially America, would look fundamentally different. I don't want to, get into pure speculation, but there might be a substantially more free Caribbean. There might be a lot less America. This is one of those historical inflection points that I think is very, very fascinating. And the fact that Napoleon did not do that, to his great detriment and to the waste of thousands and thousands of lives, is a clear indicator, one of the clearest indicators of where his true values lay and where much of the material and social forces of Europe were directed. So anyway, that's the Haitian Revolution. There's a lot more to say, but I hope that you found this interesting and educational. I hope that you, like me, now believe and understand how important the Haitian Revolution is to the history of liberation everywhere, to the history of the West, to the history of our country. And I hope that you will, if we are given the chance, fight and holler at our government to recognize the democratically elected leaders of Haiti, that you will join me in calling for America to stop fucking interfering in Haiti, stop mucking around in their constitution and supporting strongmen and essentially, stomping around like it's our colony, because we are still currently manipulating their people and their affairs and refusing to grant Haiti the independence and self-reliance and support that it deserves as, a fellow nation of the revolution, a fellow, free country in the West. And that's all I have to say about that. So thanks everybody for listening. It's Women's History Month, and I'll be switching to to that over the next few weeks. I've got some really exciting things to talk about. I'll be talking about Ethelfled and the Anglo-Saxon women of early England next week. And I hope that you all enjoyed this, and you will join me again next week. Smash that like button. Tell your friends. Have a good Friday. I love you all, and I'll see you soon.